Hey guys, welcome back to The Grey Escape. I'm Natalie Gray, and I have a very special guest today, his third time on The Grey Escape. You've heard him before on episode 22, Roswell Revealed, and episode 34, An Atheist in Heaven. I'll tell you who it is and all about today's show right after this. Paul Davids is my guest today, filmmaker, author, speaker, artist, and my friend. Paul wrote and produced a cult classic movie in 1994, Roswell, detailing the alleged crash of an alien craft in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. If that is your cup of tea, be sure to go back and check out episode 22, Roswell Revealed. Today, he's here to talk about another documentary he made called Marilyn Monroe Declassified. Marilyn Monroe, of course, the American actress famous for her blonde bombshell roles and for being one of the most iconic sex symbols in history. She died tragically August 5th, 1962 in Brentwood, Los Angeles, of an apparent suicide. But when FBI documents were declassified, some pretty juicy stuff was unearthed, the kind of stuff that makes great fodder for documentaries, and Paul is here to discuss just some of the tidbits in his very juicy and excellent documentary, Marilyn Monroe Declassified. We're diving right in with Mr. Paul Davids.
So a lot of these same people show up, in the saga of the Kennedy assassination. Some of these players show up in the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby. The public was never told about Jack Ruby's mob connections at that time, but it's comfortable to say that he was Sam Giancana's man in Texas. I mean, he was...
Wow.
He was dealing with the numbers, rackets, and prostitutes. And there's a book called Double Cross, which I know we'll get back to, written by Sam Giancana's nephew, who has the same name, Sam Giancana, and Giancana's brother, Chuck. They claimed that Jack Ruby, worked for Sam Giancana. So, look, as I began the Marilyn Monroe investigation for the movie, all these names came up, a lot of stories came up, documents came up. The documents really triggered the movie. I mean, when I found out that director Philippe Mora, is quite well known, he's directed many films, Australia director, that he's the one credited with having stumbled upon an FBI document that, in a sense, implicates Robert Kennedy in Marilyn Monroe's death. This was declassified years after it was written. And the first time, when it was declassified, it was just put back into the FBI files. It was declassified and it wasn't released to the public. We know from the mafia Wiretapping, he may not have been mafia, but he did tap her house on behalf of Jimmy Hoffa, and that's Fred Otash. He said that Peter Lawford came to him that night, desperate for help. This was before it would have been reported to the police. Desperate for help to sanitize her house and get rid of evidence that could have implicated Bobby Kennedy in any way. And that Bobby Kennedy had been there that afternoon. That's what Fred Otash said he heard from Peter Lawford. All that's consistent, with what we know. But you do have that gap from midnight to 4:30 a.m. And then it turns out that the gap is longer than that, because we found out that Arthur Jacobs, Marilyn Monroe's studio publicist, that night was at the Hollywood Bowl hearing a Henry Mancini concert. and that he got the word about Marilyn's death before the concert was over. So this now...
how would he even get word? I mean, this was pre-pagers
They sent somebody to him to tell him.
How would they even find him at the Hollywood Bowl? I mean, there's thousands of people there.
People have reserved tickets. But there's solid testimony on that. He was there with his wife. And so that pushes back to around 10 p.m. when they found her body. So you have an interesting situation where Police Chief Tom Redden said it was an intelligence operation, handled like an intelligence situation. So there were high-level, cleared intelligence police officers involved in the whole sanitation effort. Before Desk Sergeant Jack Clemens even shows up at 4:30 in the morning, he thinks he's the first cop on the scene. He says it looked like she was that her position was staged on the bed. The caps were neatly on the pill bottles that were out there. There was no glass of water that he could find. He said that he said her housekeeper was doing the laundry when he arrived at 4:30 in the morning. I mean, it's so bizarre. And the excuse of Marilyn Monroe's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, who was there too when Clemens arrived, his excuse for the delay in calling the police was, we had to let the studio publicity department know about this first.
Which is absurd.
Clemens said as much. And got fired for objecting.
Right.
So if he got fired for objecting, there were people in the LAPD at that time who knew all the facts, who were way above his head, who had to make a certain story stick, and they didn't want it contested. Now, there are a few real surprises, I think, that come out in Marilyn Monroe Declassified.
Yes, there are.
And... what do they say? Spoiler alert?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I don't want to in any way say something you don't want me to reveal about the movie.
Well, so. I think that people would hopefully only all the more want to see the movie and see all the pieces and testimony for themselves. So I don't think we'll withhold any of their findings. So when the book Double Cross came out, and I said Sam Giancana, the nephew, Chuck Giancana, wrote this book about the head of the Chicago syndicate, Sam Mooney Giancana. We'll call him by his nickname Mooney right now, so keep him confused from the author of the book. Keep from getting confused about the author of the book. So the authors of the book claimed that their relative, Mooney, had confessed to them that he had Marilyn Monroe offed as a contract killing, but that he had done it under contract from the CIA.
God.
Now, this is the clunker in the mystery. Why would he confess? Why would he say the CIA was involved if it wasn't? We know he was working with the CIA at that time. And what would the CIA's interest have been? This is why when the document surfaced signed by James Angleton, head of counterintelligence for the CIA, and signed a day before her death, and it was a memo about a wiretap, an overheard conversation, which suggested that John F. Kennedy, in Pillow Talk, had told Marilyn classified things that she wasn't entitled to know. And that these wiretaps also indicated that she was very unsettled, unstable, and was thinking of holding a press conference and going public on everything. So at this point, you have the possibility that national security information that never should have been disclosed to her could come out at a Marilyn Monroe press conference.
Right.
Now, my theory is that, the press conference may never have happened had she lived. It could have just been something that she said to a friend on the phone in the heat of exasperation.
Right.
And didn't really mean and wouldn't have followed through on. But when that word would have gotten back to those at the CIA who would have been concerned about it, such as James Angleton, these are not men trained in taking a chance on something like that, right? They're always evaluating the value of secrecy and national security versus the question of one individual life. In this case, the one individual life happened to be a massively famous worldwide icon. But she had been under their surveillance for years.
Just because of her association with the Kennedys?
No, before.
Oh.
It started with her marriage to Arthur Miller.
Oh.
You know, she had several marriages.
Yes.
The first was Jim Dougherty, who was kind of the boy next door. I think she was 16, 17.
Wasn't that kind of a favor as well? He married her when she was 16 as a favor.
Yeah, it was 16. Yeah, she would have had to go back to the orphanage at that time. She'd been an orphan. She'd had like 9 foster homes. She spent her whole childhood either going from foster home to foster home or living in an orphanage. This was not a happy childhood. And her mother had psychological problems. And so she didn't want to go back to the orphanage, and Jim Dougherty proposed to her. The marriage didn't last long. He joined the Merchant Marines. And we're talking World War II. And she got more and more involved in working as a professional model for the first time while he was gone. And when he heard about it, he didn't really approve of her, posing, making a living that way. And so it ended in divorce. She fought really hard to establish herself as an actress, taking really small bit parts at first. And wasn't until she got an agent named Johnny Hyde, who really loved her. He worked for William Morris. He was a top agent, and he believed in her completely. And he just fought to get her the roles. And he was responsible for bringing her to the attention of John Huston to get her into the Asphalt Jungle. So Johnny Hyde wanted to marry her. He was rich. He had a heart condition. He knew he was going to die. She said no. She said he even left his family for her, thinking she would marry him. But she never led him on to say that she would, and she turned him down. She said she'd had that first marriage, and if she married again, it was going to have to be for love. And she didn't love him. She would have been a millionaire several times over at that point had she married him, because he did die about 6 months later.
Goodness.
And when he died, that was also hard on her career, because he was the one that was getting her the parts. So then came her marriage with Joe DiMaggio, the great baseball player, New York Yankees. And the time she met him, she didn't know whether he was a baseball player or a football player. She didn't even know. I don't think she knew what a shortstop was, But their marriage was a big event that got massive worldwide attention and publicity. Then she went off to Korea. She sang for the troops. It was the Korean War at that time. And the marriage with Joe DiMaggio, lasted a few years, but that didn't endure either. They had problems in the marriage. He was very sort of, sort of Italian, protective of his wife, and her independence was a bit too much for him. There's the famous story about when she was making the 7-Year Itch with that dress that blows up, and exposes her panties. Yeah, that he got so upset and hit the roof when he was there that night when they were filming that scene. His wife being exposed that way in a movie, he couldn't take it. So that didn't last. So the third marriage was to playwright Arthur Miller, who she had met with Elia Kazan, great director. And Arthur Miller is one of America's greatest playwrights. He wrote A Death of a Salesman, View from the Bridge, The Crucible. So that marriage didn't last either. You know, they got married around the time she was going off to England to do The Prince and the Showgirl. And it was the time of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And Arthur Miller was very left-leaning. He wrote for communist newspapers. If not an outright communist, he was certainly sort of a fellow traveler. And he was censured by the House Un-American Activities Committee that called him to testify when he refused to name names. I mean, we know people were blacklisted for that. She was married to him then.
Wow.
Of course she was wiretapped. Of course. I want to say something else about the wiretapping. If people have questioned, all these different people were wiretapping her and listening in on everything that was happening in her life. After she died, when the house was sold, the new owners of the house reported that when they did remodeling, that wires were found everywhere.
Oh, boy.
So it was like everything in her life. She was conversations in her living room were being listened to, or phone calls. And this was certainly a form of harassment.
Horrible.
You know, how much did she know? We don't know for sure. She seemed to use her telephone an awful lot. I mentioned Fred Otash, wiretapper. He also wiretapped Peter Lawford's house because President Kennedy used to party there when he came to California. Marilyn Monroe would be at those parties too. He talked about how he did the wiretaps, where he put them. And he was working with a man named Bernard Spindell. And Spindell claimed later that he had wiretaps from Marilyn Monroe's house the day she died. People have drawn the conclusion that it would have included the conversations with Bobby Kennedy when he was there in the afternoon. And his house was raided. All of his tapes were taken. It was a New York prosecutor that arranged for it. He was charged with illegal wiretapping.
Wow.
He filed a lawsuit to try to get the tapes back. And in the lawsuit, part of the lawsuit text on the case was that he claimed that those wiretaps, if he got them back, would show that the circumstances of Marilyn Monroe's death were not as they had been reported. And this was an article in the New York Times. He never got the tapes back. Officially, the tapes were lost. He was sent to jail for wiretapping.
Wow.
He died in jail.
Oh, God.
So that was part of what was going on behind the scenes.
Horrible, even though he was hired by apparently a government agency, right?
Well, I'm not sure. I think that he was hired by Giancana or Jimmy Hoffa. The Jimmy Hoffa connection is important here because, he was the head of the Teamsters. And to understand this murder in all of its dimensions, you need to understand that at that time, Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, had made it his personal mission in life to go after the mobsters and put them all behind bars. Going after getting them all like they got Al Capone.
I just want to say as well, for people who are non-Hollywood people, what the Teamsters are is basically the transportation of the film industry, right? All the trucks and trucking.
The truckers, their union. It's their union.
Right, okay.
And there's a lot of information about Jimmy Hoffa having invested the union funds with Sam Giancana so that he could build Las Vegas casinos. This was during the whole time of the rise of Las Vegas. So Bobby Kennedy was looking into the corruption involved with this. He was going after Jimmy Hoffa, going after Sam Giancana, and other mobsters. And the problem this presented for the Kennedys the full implications of this weren't adequately thought through because, first of all, the Kennedy family connection with the mob in the United States went back to the father, Joseph Kennedy. He was a bootlegger, and he had arrangements with the mob. So they, in competition with each other, and they had understandings so the wrong people wouldn't get killed. And during the election of 1960, which was Richard Nixon versus John F. Kennedy, the first presidential election that had debates, during that election, they knew it was going to be very, very close, and it's easy to check the documentation and the historical record that the mob helped Kennedy win Illinois, the state of Illinois, that there was vote tampering in Chicago.
Wow.
And had Kennedy lost the state of Illinois, Nixon would have been president. He would have lost the presidency. And the mob had been asked for this help by Joseph Kennedy. He had a meeting with Sam Giancana that said Kennedy administration is going to be much more friendly to the mob than a Nixon administration. You want business as usual? Have my son, Jack Kennedy, in the White House. Well, when Jack Kennedy appointed Robert Kennedy to be Attorney General. And Robert Kennedy took it upon himself to go after the mobsters with a vengeance.
Did they not take him aside? Like, hey, bro, you need to know something.
I don't know what would have ever been said to him, but nothing stopped him.
Wow.
It was like he had a vendetta against the mobsters, and they had a vendetta against the Kennedys. So Sam Giancana, who had a secret kind of alliance with John F. Kennedy at the beginning of the presidency, they even shared a mistress in common, and that was Judith Exner Campbell. And she acted as a go-between, sometimes taking an envelope from President Kennedy to Sam Giancana. And it's documented that John Kennedy even provided Sam Giancana up to a certain point with the FBI morning reports.
Oh my goodness! This is another movie you have to make.
I don't know that I'm the one to make it, Natalie. But the point is, at a certain point, John F. Kennedy cut Sam Giancana off, and he was no longer getting those morning reports, and he had to be so careful about his appearance of having mob connections that he insulted Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, who, along with, Peter Lawford and, there was Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin and what did they call that?
The Rat Pack.
Yes, it was the Rat Pack. Yeah. And then there was Frank Sinatra, who was a friend of Marilyn Monroe. He even gifted her a little dog that she named Moff for mafia.
Oh.
So at one point when Frank Sinatra thought that he was a good friend of the Kennedys, might even get to sing at the White House, he built a helicopter pad at his Palm Springs estate so that the president could arrive, by helicopter, and made other major modifications in the compound that he thought were for the benefit of the president, to be able to visit there and not just Peter Lawford in Malibu. And when he got the word that on a president's visit, the president was not going to land there, I think the president went to Bing Crosby's estate instead.
Well, of all the nerve.
And yeah, Frank Sinatra took a sledgehammer and smashed up the helicopter pad. So you got to understand, there's a lot of bad blood here with all of these interconnections, and there were a lot of enemies of the Kennedys, Bobby and Jack Kennedy. And Marilyn Monroe was a pawn. She's an unwitting, somewhat naive pawn caught right in the middle of it, who's being wiretapped on hopes that Kennedy's enemies can pick up information that could be harmful to him to bring him down.
And to be clear as well, when you say wiretap, she never ever was aware. She wasn't literally wearing a wire. She was just unknowingly
her
being
phone
recorded.
Her phone was being tapped, and her conversations in her private conversations in her house were being recorded ever since the days of her marriage to Arthur Miller. And then it only magnified when she had the relationship with President Kennedy. And the public knew absolutely nothing.
So the Arthur Miller put her on a bit of a commie watch list.
Yes.
And then she just stayed on their radar.
Well, and she intensified the problem by having a number of either extremely left-leaning or outright communist friends. She took a trip to Mexico and visited a Vanderbilt heir who had been disinherited for his outright communist affiliation. So she's visiting him in Mexico, outside the country, at a time when she has information, she's been sleeping with the president. So this legitimized the CIA's involvement in bugging her and following her, because the CIA's charter puts it with the responsibility for foreign espionage.
Right. She would literally be a threat of and be under suspicion as being a foreign spy if she had information that the president had told her. Hadn't he told her something about, or she'd asked curiously, how the nuclear testing had gone in Nevada? Yes.
And we know that from an FBI memo we have that's been declassified, from an FBI agent who had heard through wiretapping her asking President Kennedy about an H-bomb test in Nevada, as you say. And she'd also asked him about the plans to assassinate Castro. And she'd expressed her opinion.
So this is big info for a starlet.
Yes, she's in way over her head. I mean, she may have asked some questions simply to try to show her awareness of current events. That we're doing a test of the H-bomb. But the moment she says something to the president, it has implications way beyond her naive curiosity. So, she was caught in the middle. Now, one of the things that I think my film accomplishes, and I'd be interested in your opinion here, is it shows that Bobby Kennedy was a man caught in the middle too. There are some who have claimed that Bobby Kennedy was responsible for her death and that the Kennedys wanted to get rid of her. That story has been out there for a long time. But in the Sam Giancana testimony, in the story put forward in the book Double Cross, it is stated that when Sam Giancana was asked to eliminate Marilyn Monroe on behalf of the CIA, it was placed at his disposal how to handle it and when. And because of the wiretaps, he knew that Bobby Kennedy was there that afternoon. So in deciding to strike that day, according to Double Cross, he was attempting to entrap his bitter, blood-feud enemy, Bobby Kennedy.
Oh, what a bonus. Hey, I have to get rid of this girl and I can frame my enemy at the same time?
Yes, to try to bring down the Kennedy administration. And one of his shocks, one of the grave disappointments that Sam Giancana experienced was when he woke up the next day and expected that this would be blamed on Bobby Kennedy, that Bobby Kennedy
murdered Marilyn,
never mentioned. It was even you see, murdered. I mean, even the Bobby Kennedy was there in that afternoon. They had wiretaps it was a fight. There was a fight
so
between
she
them.
Killed herself over Bobby Kennedy.
It could have looked that way. That would have been enough to bring down the administration, to show her involvement with Bobby Kennedy, that he had been there that afternoon. And the housekeeper, Eunice Murray, stated in later years, unequivocally, that Bobby had been there that afternoon and that there had been a fight. And she said it had gotten very sticky. And she said, and so the protectors of Bobby Kennedy had to step in I don't think it was the protectors of Bobby Kennedy who stepped in, because if the Sam Giancana story is to be believed, and I think it is, then they were trying to entrap Bobby Kennedy at that time. And and they failed. But the lies that were told to make the official story that Bobby Kennedy was not in Los Angeles that day, there are so many lies that were told. It ends up that about 18 witnesses saw Bobby Kennedy in town that day, and then you do have the later testimony from the later police chiefs about what happened, Redden and Gates. But Bobby Kennedy's alibi for him not being in Los Angeles on that day that Marilyn Monroe died was an attorney named John Bates, who had a ranch near San Francisco. And supposedly Kennedy had been there with his family that day and had never left the ranch. There are photos that show that he was at the ranch. His family was at the ranch. But the story is that, that he left the ranch, that there was a plane that took him into L.A. That's what Daryl Gates said. That he left L.A. after her death at about midnight that night. There's a policeman, Lynn Franklin, who stopped the car Bobby Kennedy was in, was speeding. Peter Lawford was driving.
Wow.
This was near midnight. And Peter Lawford said, well, I've got to get the Attorney General to his hotel. He has to get his things.
In Los Angeles?
Yeah, he has to leave town. Wow. This happened in Los Angeles. So there's the testimony from Lynn Franklin, who's a decorated Beverly Hills cop. That, so you would have Bobby Kennedy coming in that day, talking to her in the afternoon, departing late at night, and then going back to the ranch. Now, John Bates, whose ranch it was, said that never happened.
Wow. Never
happened. It couldn't have happened unless Bobby Kennedy had a twin. But you'll see his testimony in the movie, Marilyn Monroe Declassified. You'll see that testimony when he's asked, were you with Bobby Kennedy when Bobby heard the news of Marilyn's death? And he says, yes, I believe I was. Oh, how did you hear about it? I believe we picked it up on the radio. And then he's asked, and what was the Attorney General's reaction to Marilyn Monroe's death? And he pauses a few seconds, and he bites his lips, and his eyes turn one way or another.
Because he doesn't know.
And he doesn't know what to say. And he says, well, I don't recall any specific reaction. Now, Bobby Kennedy, who was so close to Marilyn Monroe, is it believable that he's not going to have any reaction? If he was in the car with John Bates the next day, when it came in over the radio, Bobby Kennedy would have already known she was dead. Yeah. That would explain why there was no reaction. But one of the things my film turns up that I don't think anyone has mentioned before, as I was going over the footage of the Senate crime hearings where Robert Kennedy is grilling Sam Giancana and saying, do you handle your enemies, Mr. Giancana, by bumping them off and sticking them in the trunk of a car? Is that what you do, Mr. Giancana? Mr. Giancana says, declined to answer on the grounds that it might tend to incriminate me, which he says in response to dozens of questions.
Right.
And I noticed that sitting next to Sam Giancana at the witness table, his attorney is John Bates. He's a younger John Bates, but it's the same man. And when I put their faces side by side in the movie so that you can see the John Bates who's saying Kennedy was with me when he heard about Marilyn Monroe. And then you see he is the chief lawyer for the mobster Sam Giancana. What was Bobby Kennedy? And then here's the other twist. At one point, there isn't much on the internet about John Bates. Hard to find a lot about him. But there is one thing that in his law career, he was offered an important job with the Kennedy administration in the government, and he turned it down.
So they're offering a job in their Kennedy administration to a guy who's the lawyer of their supposed sworn enemy.
Yeah. Well, he turned it down. I mean, once a mob lawyer, always a mob lawyer. I don't know. Is that a fair?
I would think you'd be hard to lose the connection to the mob. Maybe you wouldn't want to. I mean, they sound like useful people to know.
This case is so convoluted, and there are those who claim and fight for it that it may not have been deliberate suicide of Marilyn Monroe, but if it wasn't, that it was accidental overdose. There are those that claim that and try to prove it. In my opinion, all of those proofs fall short, and they are way overridden by all of the rest of the testimony about what was happening then. You know, the reversal of the testimony of Eunice Murray and what she kept secret all those years. The fact that Ralph Greenson, the psychiatrist of Marilyn, who never disclosed anything, his Marilyn files are still under seal. And there was a BBC reporter that badgered him about it, and he said, "Look," he said, "my problem is I wish I could." He says, "I can't tell you part of the story without you having the whole story, and there are things that I can't say. I'm not at liberty to disclose." He said, "Look, go ask Bobby Kennedy." He says, "Go ask Bobby Kennedy." So I don't think that it was an accidental overdose, as some claim. I think that this puts pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together in a way that are completely intelligible. And once you have the confession of Sam Giancana's relatives that Mooney said he did it and did it at the behest of the CIA,
right,
and you have the CIA document written a day before her death, based on wiretaps, where they're worried that she's going to go public with national security information, you have enough there to put two and two together. And then when you add to that all the things that happened a year or so later with Mary Pinchot Meyer's death, a year after John F. Kennedy's death, she was Kennedy's closest mistress. She had kept a diary, too. She did not believe the Warren report that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in assassinating President Kennedy. She was going to open her mouth about it. She was divorced from Cord Meyer, who was one of the top people at the CIA at that time, who worked closely with James Angleton. She was married to this top CIA agent. She's letting family friends know she doesn't accept the Warren Commission report. She's going to go after, she's going to fight. She's jogging one day near her Georgetown pad, and she's shot with 2 bullets, one to the head. The man that is picked up and prosecuted for her murder is found not guilty. There was never sufficient evidence to convince any jury beyond reasonable doubt, and a lot of evidence that he was framed. And then you have James Angleton showing up, the Bradley James Angleton connection between the two, and the search for Mary Pinchot Meyer's diary. Suspicious, absolutely suspicious. And then there is another book I'll refer you to. It's called Mary's Mosaic, written by Peter Janney. I think it's a brilliant book, and it's entirely about the murder of Mary Pinchot Meyer. Peter Janney was the son of a CIA agent at that time who worked with Cord Meyer and James Angleton. So this was the son trying to unravel the involvement of his father in all of this, and he does a brilliant job of it. So I urge your listeners to see Marilyn Monroe Declassified, and I'm really happy that the people at FilmRise, a terrific distributor, went to bat for this movie, believe that it should be seen, and they're putting the reputation of their company behind it.
Well, with your permission, I mean, I was quite blown away by your film. At several points for me, there was plot twists where I thought I knew the direction it was going, and then I was like, oh my God, I was pulled in, and it's not those people responsible. But with your permission, I'd like to discuss some of those moments.
Please.
If it's okay. I mean, for starters, the medical autopsy thing, to me, it seemed just irrefutable. At that point, I was convinced, okay, A, there's no way this was a suicide, because they talk about the particular barbiturates or pills that she apparently had taken. And the person who did, because 2 people did the autopsy, is that correct? Or 2 people did a death certificate?
I guess the death certificate, the autopsy, well, Noguchi.
Yes, Noguchi.
As a young, he wasn't a full coroner at that time. But he had tissue samples that were sent to the lab, and he was asking for information about the tissue samples, and all the biological specimens were lost by the lab.
What was there 2 of? Was it 2 death certificates? It was either two people doing an autopsy or 2 death certificates.
There were 2 coroner's reports.
2 coroner's reports. I mean, how uncommon is that to have 2 coroner's reports?
Yeah, that some things were excised from one that weren't in the but they both said probable suicide. Now, it's not common to have the word probable in a conclusion of a coroner's report at all. To say probable suicide. One of the experts who testified said he'd been involved with 1,000 autopsies. He'd never seen probable suicide. I think the key thing in those findings connected with the autopsy was the purplish discoloration of the colon at a point where, you see, it wasn't an enema. It was a barbiturate suppository injected through the anus.
Horrible. So horrible.
And when it hits that part of the colon, then, yes, purplish discoloration there where most of the poison is. They found no dissolved capsules in her stomach.
And no discoloration. The guy, Noguchi, I guess it was, said that when these dissolve, these particular pills, they leave a dye.
A yellowish dye.
A dye, and there was no dye in her stomach.
Right. So there was every reason to believe that she hadn't died of an overdose by swallowing.
Right. She hadn't even taken these pills herself orally.
So those who deny murder, have said, okay, well, maybe it was an enema, but then was it an enema she gave herself, or she had her housekeeper because people would do enemas in those days for cleansing. It was, one of the medical fads at that time.
But you wouldn't do an enema of pills.
Well, it wouldn't have been pills. If it was done that way with an enema, it wouldn't have been pills. I mean, it would have been a liquid.
But drugs.
The point is that, Sergeant Clemens said the body looked staged on the bed. He'd seen many, many deaths from overdoses. The body goes into a kind of contortion, and he said there's always vomit. And there wasn't vomit. And she's, perfectly laid out on the bed alongside perfectly neat pill bottles that all have their caps, So you said, okay, that was one of the points in the movie where you said something is rotten in the state of Denmark.
Well, just that to me, I felt so convinced there's no way this is someone who took their own life.
Yeah.
There's just no way. The fact there wasn't the glass of water that she took the pills with. I mean, you can't swallow pills without water. So where's the glass that she took a glass of water to take the pills? But, I mean, it was huge for me, this dye business. The fact there was no dye in her stomach, but there was dye in her colon that showed, the entry point of this medicine had come from the other way. Well, if somebody was going to take their own life, I think they would just take the pills and swallow the pills. I don't see why you would go to the trouble of getting liquid medicine and doing that,
Right.
I mean, it just seemed absurd, that thought. Then the vomiting, the doctor or the person who said that you always, when you've taken so many pills, there's always a threshold that your body just can't take it anymore. Yeah. And it foams back up in your mouth. And she had none of that. So again, it's like.
And the question of whether you could take enough pills to get your blood toxicity level up to that point, which was very, very high, without dying first while you're taking the pills.
Right.
Now, there was a show, I think, called History's Mysteries or something that tried to reenact and tried to say, no, we've proven that she could have taken them orally. And I I thought that show was full of holes. I mean, if I didn't think that, I probably wouldn't have made Marilyn Monroe Declassified, or I'd come to the conclusions that I did. But so I didn't accept that outcome. But it's still a controversy, is the point. It's not, the world is not going to jump on board and say, okay, now this is absolutely proven.
Right.
Although I think that the evidence, well, what do you think? The body of the evidence all told together, you put it all
I
together?
feel very convinced.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it, of how dangerous a person Marilyn Monroe could have accidentally been to the United States without her knowing. Just the fact that she was absorbing, like, hey, honey, Mr. President, how did it go today? Oh, well, hey, we dropped a bomb in the Nevada desert to see what would happen. Wow, how did that go?
There's also the visit to the secret airbase is one of the things in that.
Area 51?
Well, this was before Area 51. It was a desert air base, and it was, 1960 when John F. Kennedy was president, or I guess he took the oath of office in 61. Well, the Roswell incident in New Mexico was in 1947. Now, some of the people listening to this show will think that the Roswell incident was the cover-up of a crash of an extraterrestrial spacecraft. And others will think that was not so, that the government report that, no, it was a secret mogul balloon experimentation and legends got out of control. Some will think that's true. Now, I produced for Showtime the movie Roswell. You have previously interviewed me about the Roswell incident. Mm-hmm. It's no secret that I believe the Roswell incident was real as an extraterrestrial event, that this has been kept secret ever since, and that the public has never been told the truth about unidentified flying objects by people in official capacity ever, except by two astronauts that discussed the truth in unofficial capacity, and that would be Gordon Cooper and Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon, both of whom said, yes, there are extraterrestrials. They are surveying Earth. Their craft are here. This is fact. You are being lied to. Those are two pretty strong sources. And I got to talk to both of them personally about it before they died. So for me, it's not far-fetched at all that President Kennedy may have shared with Marilyn Monroe the fact that there are alien beings from space. They are here. And we have proof of it, that we're concerned about it. We have the debris, and that he's going to a secret air base and is going to see those materials that weren't manufactured on Earth. To me, not far-fetched. And that shows up in the CIA document as part of the wiretap.
Isn't her name even on one of the documents that even talks about UFOs?
Well, that's the document, but it's not. It's a wiretap of a reporter from that time, a columnist, Dorothy Kilgallen, who knew Marilyn Monroe, and she's being informed by someone who had this information from Marilyn Monroe. That's the wiretap. Now, the document is real. Some have contested it and said, no, they think that the document itself, that CIA document, is a phony. There are so many arguments as to why it's real. The things we learned from other documents were declassified later as to form and structure of that kind of a report. But the most important thing is that Don Burleson, a writer and Marilyn Monroe researcher, appealed under the Freedom of Information Act to the CIA to get the physical transcripts of the wiretaps that are referred to in that document. And he was told in response to his application that they had looked and they could not find any transcripts responsive to his request. However, Mr. Burleson, if you would like to appeal our findings, you may do so. You have so many days to do your appeal, and this is how you have to file it. He filed the appeal, and for him, the key moment in all of this is the fact that the CIA accepted his appeal. He said if that document were bogus, they would never have accepted his appeal for a further search for more information. They would have rejected the document, certainly at that point, if not at the outset. and said, we're not going to accept an appeal based on a document that isn't even ours.
Right.
They didn't do that. So in my view, we have to conclude that document is true. James Angleton did sign it. James Angleton is implicated in the death of another of John F. Kennedy's mistresses, Mary Pinchot Meyer, through the testimony of what Ben Bradley, publisher of the Washington Post, has to say. And then the book, Mary's Mosaic, is absolutely damning. So I think what we've done here in this movie is unraveled. We peeled back the onion, so to speak. A secret, the secrets of a very turbulent part of American history, with Marilyn Monroe's death being the first act, let's say, of all the incredible violence and turbulence of the 1960s that followed soon thereafter. Beginning with the assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and Malcolm X. And the list goes on and on and on. That was a intensely dangerous, dark time. Seymour Hersh wrote The Dark Side of Camelot, the dark days, the dark side of the Kennedy administration. And I think Marilyn Monroe Declassified will enlighten everyone who sees it about what was really going on. And you don't have to believe anymore the coroner's conclusion that she died from a probable suicide. She didn't. She didn't take her own life. She did not.
Yeah, I felt very clear of that by the end of the film. I have to say another thing that perplexed me a little bit, though, and you might be able to answer this, is with the testimony of, is it Chuck Giancana?
The brother.
The author the young guy.
Oh, the young one was Sam Giancana.
Sam Giancana. Why would someone, given that you're talking about people who have no bones about killing people if they're ticked off, why would you come out and write a book and talk about, hey, my uncle, he topped Marilyn Monroe? Why would you come out and say this? Would you not fear for your life?
Well, I think you'd have to ask him. He was on an episode of Entertainment Tonight that did a book review of his book when he explained all this. And they wrote the book, and the book has these things to say not only about Marilyn Monroe, but all the other things that the Chicago Syndicate was doing at that time. Now, why he would come forward, they wanted to set the record straight. I think the family, to a certain extent, felt sorrow, shame, and, secondhand guilt, maybe.
For taking out
guilt.
An iconic element of pop culture?
Well, for the things that their predecessors did. And they felt that they were setting the record straight. And I certainly believe it. I do not think that they would have come forward with a concocted story, particularly in this case, that the story about Giancana's connection to the getting the go-ahead from the CIA to do this, the elimination of Marilyn Monroe. I don't think that ever would have been invented, and yet it jives so completely with the document that we,
have the CIA ever come forward to say, hey, that book's a crock?
I've never seen anything like that. I've never seen anyone say that to that kind of.
So I guess the fact in itself that no denial came forward is also quite telling.
Mooney, Sam Giancana the elder, he felt in some ways, that he was an American patriot. He may have been the head of the Chicago Syndicate, but that was their business. And he was cooperating with the CIA in the efforts to get rid of Fidel Castro. And even though they didn't succeed at that, the story is that his relationship with the CIA was even strengthened after that. And yet he couldn't tell anyone. So the FBI was going after him at the same time. One of the interesting stories is that he had landed at some airport. Maybe it was the Chicago airport. And FBI agents were there at the airport, and they didn't have authority to arrest him as he got off the plane, but they taunted him as he got off the plane. There were newsmen there, and they basically said, you disgusting slime. Look at Sam Giancana, this worthless piece of, you know what I'm saying. And he couldn't say, you fools, do you know I'm working for our own CIA?
I'm the biggest
do you know
patriot.
I'm a patriot.
I love this country,
Yes.
and I'm helping protect
Yes.
it. And,
Yes. So these are the ironies.
yeah.
And that's history now.
Yeah.
None of this is a criticism or critique in any respect of the CIA today. We're talking history. We're talking the 1950s and the early 1960s.
Right.
And that's it. And things have changed. But let's own up to our history and see the movie Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, it's an
Declassified.
excellent film. And I even watched it on a little screen on my laptop with time code going across it. And I still loved it. It will get your mind going, tick tock, tick tock. And also, if this is true, what else is true? I'm excited for what else is in the pipeline. Do you have something that you've got coming in the future? You're allowed to give us a sneak.
I can't say right now that
right.
I think it's a vacation and doing more paintings.
Yes, okay.
All right.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out, letting me come to your home. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you again, Paul Davids, for joining me for your third time on The Grey Escape. And everyone else, definitely check out Marilyn Monroe Declassified. I just had a Google, and you can watch it on Amazon Prime or rent it. It really is good. I would not say it. It was very eye-opening, shocking, entertaining, disturbing, demystifying. It was all those things you want in a documentary. So check it out. As always, on thegrayscape.com, I'll put links to all stuff Paul Davids to make it a one-stop shop for you to check him out. Thank you guys, as always, for listening. If you happen to be an iTunes user, I would love it if you would give a little rating on iTunes. That would be amazing for the podcast. It helps give other people confidence in listening to the show. So that's a wrap. Take care, everybody. Hope to be back soon, right here, in your ears, in your head, in your brain, in your mind, in your consciousness, on The Grey Escape.